There is a silence in history that few dare to notice. A silence so vast that it swallows nearly 3 centuries of our past. Imagine this. The year is 1719, not 2019. The medieval castles we think of as built in the 900s never existed. The emperors crowned in Aachen. Fabrications. Even the man we know as Charlemagne, the father of Europe, the mighty king who shaped an empire, may be nothing more than an invention written into parchment centuries after his supposed reign. This is not folklore, nor a bedtime tale whispered by grandmothers. It is a hypothesis born not from mystics but from historians who looked too closely at the cracks in our timeline. It is called the phantom time hypothesis, and tonight we will descend into its labyrinth. When I first stumbled upon the theory, I thought it was a joke. How could anyone erase or invent 300 years of history without the world noticing? But as I turned page after page of missing records, irregular calendars, and strange silences in the archaeological record, I felt a chill. What if we are not living in the 21st century at all, but in the 18th? What if everything we know, our calendars, our anniversaries, our perception of time itself, has been deliberately bent so that we walk inside a narrative that was never ours? This story begins, not in the Middle Ages but in the 20th century, with one man whose audacity was to question history itself. His name was Heribert Illig, a German historian with a sharp eye for detail and a mind restless with suspicion. In the early 1990s, Illig proposed something so outrageous that most academics laughed him out of the room. He claimed that the years AD 614 to 911, almost 3 full centuries, were fabricated, inserted into the calendar by powerful rulers who wanted to legitimize their reigns by stretching the past. Illig suggested that our history is not linear but artificially inflated, and that the Dark Ages, those centuries of scarcity, famine, plague, and silence, never actually occurred. Instead, the period was manufactured, a phantom added to the timeline like an invisible bridge connecting antiquity to the Middle Ages. Why would anyone do this? Illig pointed to Emperor Otto III of the Holy Roman Empire, who ruled at the turn of the first millennium. He dreamed of living in the year 1000, a sacred number with prophetic significance. Alongside Pope Sylvester II, Otto may have conspired to push history forward by almost 3 centuries, rewriting annals, fabricating charters, and creating a past that placed him in the divine center of destiny. And Charlemagne? Illig argued that he was the greatest invention of all, a political fiction designed to give Otto a glorious ancestor, a heroic model to legitimize his empire. For Illig, Charlemagne's palaces, wars, and coronations were no more real than the figures in a medieval tapestry, grand, colourful, and carefully woven, but not alive. When Illig presented his hypothesis, the academic world reacted with scorn. Professors called it absurd, a fantasy unworthy of serious consideration. And yet, despite the mockery, Illig pressed forward, because he saw patterns that could not be ignored. He noticed that from the early 600s to the early 900s, archaeology falls strangely silent. Cities that should have been bustling with life left behind no ruins. Monumental buildings, the kind that define other centuries, appear to vanish. Even everyday objects, pottery, tools, and manuscripts, are curiously absent or suspiciously few in number. Whole centuries seemed to pass without leaving fingerprints. If time is a river, then these centuries felt like water missing from its bed. Illig also questioned the Gregorian calendar reform of 1582. Pope Gregory XIII ordered 10 days to be skipped to realign the calendar with the solar year. But Illig noticed a problem. If the calendar had been drifting at the rate it should have since the Julian system was introduced, the adjustment should have been 13 days, not 10. Where had the missing 3 days gone? To Illig, the answer was chilling. Those extra days belonged to centuries that never existed, centuries added later by human hands. The reform, rather than correcting the calendar, had quietly confirmed that phantom years were already embedded within it. But perhaps the most haunting piece of Illig's argument came from the figure of Charlemagne, the so-called father of Europe. According to official history, Charlemagne built an empire stretching across modern France, Germany and Italy. He commissioned palaces, fought endless wars and crowned himself Emperor of the Romans in the year 800. Yet Illig claimed there was a glaring problem. The evidence for Charlemagne's life is strangely inconsistent. The few statues attributed to him look suspiciously idealized, like later creations. His letters and decrees often survive only in copies written centuries afterward. His grand palace at Aachen, supposedly the seat of imperial power, appears curiously out of place for the time. A building too advanced, too sudden, as if it were transplanted from another era. To Illig, Charlemagne was not flesh and blood but ink and parchment. A legend created to justify Otto III's empire. By inventing Charlemagne, Otto and his circle could anchor themselves in a golden past, one that never truly existed. The idea was bold, but it struck at the heart of European identity. If Charlemagne never lived, then what else in history was fiction? What else had been painted into the record to make us believe we were heirs to 1,000 years of civilization, when in truth centuries of it might be a mirage? So the phantom time hypothesis began to spread, no longer just a fringe idea, but a whispered question that refused to die. Historians have long called the centuries after the fall of Rome the Dark Ages, but Illig asked a simple, unsettling question. Dark for whom? Darkness usually means ignorance, collapse or decline. But what if the darkness is not cultural, but archival? What if there is no evidence because those centuries were never there to begin with? From the year 614 to 911, the world supposedly endured endless invasions, plagues and political fragmentation. Yet where are the ruins, the manuscripts, the coins? Where are the scars carved into stone by centuries of chaos? Instead, we find continuity. Roman roads still in use, Roman cities still standing, Roman traditions still alive, almost as if time had skipped forward without the centuries of collapse we were taught to imagine. Illig's critics point to monasteries, to scattered chronicles, to a few half-preserved artifacts. But when measured against the weight of 300 years, these fragments look suspiciously thin. Compare them with the flourishing centuries that followed, the 11th and 12th centuries, filled with cathedrals, trade routes, and new literature, and the contrast is blinding. It is as if civilization had been asleep, dreaming faintly, only to wake up fully formed centuries later. To Illig, this was not sleep at all, it was invention. The Dark Ages were not dark because people lived poorly, they were dark because history itself had been painted onto a canvas that once stood blank. One of the strangest signs lies in the architecture. Buildings said to have been erected in the 7th, 8th, or 9th centuries often look suspiciously like structures from the 10th or even 11th centuries. The Palatine Chapel in Aachen, supposedly built for Charlemagne around the year 800, resembles a style far ahead of its time. Its design mirrors Byzantine and later Romanesque architecture, as if the builders had jumped centuries in a single leap. Was this the work of forgotten genius, or the result of later architect backdating their creations to fill the gap of missing centuries? Even documents from this era raise doubts. The chronicles of the Carolingian court exist mostly in copies written much later, filled with inconsistencies and suspiciously modern phrasing. A few coins attributed to Charlemagne and his heirs look strangely uniform, as if mass-produced long after their supposed minting. Illig argued that these were signs of retroactive history, later generations writing themselves a deeper past. To believe in phantom time is to believe that Europe's greatest legends may be no more than clever inventions, stitched together from fragments of older Rome and later medieval grandeur. But once you glimpse the seams, the illusion becomes harder to ignore. To most people, the calendar is just a tool, days, months, years arranged to guide our lives. But to Heribert Illig, the calendar was a crime scene. He noticed that in 1582, when Pope Gregory XIII reformed the old Julian calendar, something didn't add up. The Julian system, established by Julius Caesar in 45 BC, added a leap day every 4 years, but this calculation was slightly inaccurate. It created an error of roughly 1 day every 128 years. By the late 1500s, nearly 16 centuries had passed since Caesar's reform, which meant the calendar should have drifted around 13 days out of alignment with the solar year, and yet Gregory's reform corrected only 10 days. 3 days were missing. To Illig, those 3 days were not just a clerical error, they were evident. If 3 centuries had been fabricated, years written into history but never lived, then the calendar would have skipped forward by exactly those 3 days. In other words, the reform itself was the smoking gun, proof not of papal accuracy but of historical fraud. To the world, Gregory's change was a practical correction. To Illig, it was a quiet confession that time itself had been forged. Of course, defenders of mainstream history had an answer. They argued that the Church had deliberately chosen a 10-day correction instead of 13 for liturgical reasons, to realign Easter and other feasts with traditional dates rather than astronomical precision. Others said the drift of the Julian calendar was slightly slower than Illig calculated, reducing the gap. But Illig countered with a stubborn question: why would the guardians of time, the very institution that defined centuries, get their own numbers wrong? The phantom time hypothesis suggested that Gregory's reform was not sloppy but strategic, that the missing 3 days were not an accident but a cover, one last adjustment to ensure the invented centuries remained hidden inside our calendar. And yet, if this were true, the implication was staggering. Every birthday, every anniversary, every year we celebrate would be misaligned with reality by centuries. What we call the 21st century might truly be the 18th. And if that is so, what else in our understanding of history is bent, distorted or fabricated to fit a world that never was? History can lie, Illig argued, but the stars do not. Astronomers today can calculate the exact dates of eclipses and planetary alignments that occurred thousands of years ago. These celestial events should line up neatly with the chronicles of the past, a king noting an eclipse, a monk recording the darkening of the sky. But Illig noticed disturbing mismatches. Records from the so-called Dark Ages often describe eclipses that cannot be verified with modern astronomical models. At the same time, known eclipses that should have been visible across Europe leave behind no written trace. It was as if the heavens themselves were whispering, "These years never happened." Take, for example, the eclipse of May 614, which should have been visible across the Mediterranean. Hardly any sources mention it. Meanwhile, other eclipses, supposedly observed in the 9th century, align better with dates 3 centuries later. For Illig, this was more than coincidence. It was physics defying history, the eternal clock of the universe contradicting the fragile parchment of men. If the records do not match the stars, which one do we trust? Critics again pushed back. They argued that medieval chroniclers were imprecise, that descriptions of eclipses were often exaggerated, or that cloudy skies may have hidden the event. But Illig saw a larger pattern: silence where there should have been noise, testimony where there should have been silence. And when astronomy and archaeology both fall out of step, the suspicion grows heavier. If 3 centuries were invented, Illig argued, then the errors in recorded eclipses make perfect sense. Events attributed to the 7th, 8th or 9th centuries were not wrong, they were simply misplaced, borrowed from real phenomena that happened later. Like misplaced pages in a book, they had been slotted into the wrong chapter to extend the story, and so the phantom time hypothesis gained a terrifying weight. Not only was it rewriting kings and empires, it was rewriting the sky itself. If the heavens contradicted the chronicles, so too did the culture. In Illig's eyes, one of the greatest mysteries of the so-called missing centuries was not what survived, but what didn't. Civilizations usually leave echoes of themselves: art, tools, manuscript, architecture, tradition. Yet from the 7th to the 9th centuries, those echoes are faint. Where are the gradual transitions, the evolving artistic styles, the incremental inventions? Instead, history leaps forward like a stage play skipping 3 acts. Roman art dissolves, and suddenly Romanesque appears. Pagan traditions vanish, and suddenly a fully organized Christian empire emerges. It is as if the script was rewritten, the actors stepping on stage mid-performance with no rehearsal, and in the center of this sudden emergence stands Charlemagne, the hero who supposedly united Europe, codified laws, supported scholarship, and even launched a Carolingian Renaissance. Yet Illig asked, how does one man ignite a Renaissance when the centuries before him left almost nothing to build upon? Charlemagne felt less like a historical figure and more like a myth, inserted to bridge a void. To Illig, the Carolingian age was the keystone of a false arch. Remove it, and the entire illusion of continuity collapses. The evidence surrounding Charlemagne only deepened the suspicion. His supposed biography, the Vita Caroli Magni by Einhard, reads not like the life of a real man, but like a carefully crafted legend. Einhard, a courtier who claimed to know the emperor personally, paints Charlemagne as flawless, brave, wise, pious, beloved by all. Critics have long noted the suspicious similarity to Suetonius's biographies of Roman emperors. Was Einhard truly writing history, or copying a Roman template to fabricate one? Even more troubling are the relics of Charlemagne's empire. His bones, said to rest in Aachen Cathedral, have been re-examined by modern science. Some studies suggest they may not even belong to the right era. The coins struck in his name are oddly uniform, as if mass-minted long after his reign, and manuscripts credited to his court, like the Carolingian minuscule, a new writing style, appear almost too perfect, as though designed in hindsight to modernize Europe. To Illig, all of this pointed to one possibility: Charlemagne was less a man of flesh and blood, and more a creation of ink, parchment, and political ambition. History, Illig argued, is never neutral. It is written by those who stand to gain, and if 3 centuries were inserted into our past, someone must have profited. His eyes turned to Otto III, the Holy Roman Emperor. At the dawn of the 2nd millennium, Otto dreamed of ruling a Christian empire that stretched across Europe, a realm as glorious as ancient Rome itself. But to crown himself in the year 1000, a date charged with prophecy and divine symbolism, Otto faced a problem. The math didn't work. By the old reckoning, it was still the 7th century. The year of destiny had not yet arrived, unless of course time itself could be rewritten. Together with Pope Sylvester II, Otto may have sought to bend chronology. By adding nearly 3 centuries to the calendar, they placed themselves at the threshold of the millennium, heirs to a legacy that seemed ancient and eternal. The creation of Charlemagne, the invention of a Carolingian dynasty, the fabrication of lost centuries, all served to anchor Otto's empire in a past that never existed. If true, then the very roots of medieval Europe were fertilized not by history, but by forgery. But why would the Church participate? For the papacy, aligning itself with a fabricated past, brought immense power. By creating continuity between Rome's fallen empire and Otto's new one, the Church cast itself as the eternal guardian of Christendom, stretching unbroken across centuries. The invention of a glorious Carolingian age gave the Church authority, legitimacy, and a narrative of divine protection. It also reinforced the symbolic importance of the year 1000, the so-called dawn of the last days, when Christ might return. To sit at the center of such a prophecy was to hold not just political power, but cosmic power. Illig pointed to peculiar anomalies in medieval papal records, sudden gaps, inconsistent chronologies, charters that seemed suspiciously uniform. It was as if scribes, centuries later, had worked overtime to weave together a tapestry of continuity, filling in the holes with stories too perfect to doubt. For Otto, phantom time meant legitimacy. For the papacy, it meant eternity. And for us, centuries later, it meant living inside a calendar that might be less a mirror of reality and more a carefully crafted illusion. If Europe had invented centuries, then the illusion would collapse the moment we looked beyond its borders. After all, history does not belong to one civilization alone. The Byzantine Empire, for instance, preserved detailed chronicles during the supposed missing centuries. Wars, rulers, church
research councils, all written down with precision. The Islamic world too was thriving in the 7th, 8th and 9th centuries, producing scholars, mathematicians, and physicians whose works survive to this day, and in China the Tang dynasty flourished, leaving behind art, literature and architecture that cannot be denied. Could all of these civilizations have joined in the conspiracy? Unlikely. Illig's critics were quick to seize upon this. They argued that the phantom time hypothesis collapses the moment you consider the global record. Too many independent timelines overlap. The Tang poets of China, the Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad, the Byzantine emperors of Constantinople, they all supposedly lived during those phantom centuries. To erase them would require not just a European forgery, but a global one, coordinated across cultures, separated by ocean. And yet, Illig remained unconvinced. For Illig, these contradictions did not end the mystery, they deepened it. He argued that many of the so-called sources outside Europe are themselves later copies, compiled centuries afterward, leaving open the possibility of retroactive insertion. The Abbasid scholars we admire may have been real, but their placement in the 8th or 9th centuries could have been shifted. Even Byzantine chronicles, copied and recopied by monks, may have been subtly altered. Illig was not claiming the cultures did not exist, but that their timelines were bent, folded to align with Europe's fabricated centuries, and so the debate grew more disturbing. Were civilizations truly connected across those centuries, or had later historians woven them together to create a seamless world narrative? To mainstream historians, Illig was reckless, dismissing mountains of evidence, but to his followers he was a prophet in the wilderness, pointing out that even the most solid-seeming structures of time rest on fragile foundations. After all, history is not a photograph, it is a manuscript, copied and edited by human hands, and wherever humans write, there is room for error, or for invention. If history is a tapestry, then archaeology is the thread that binds it. Stones, bones and ruins do not lie as easily as parchment and ink. Yet for Illig, the ground beneath our feet whispered the same eerie story. 3 centuries gone missing. In the ruins of Europe, the 7th to 9th centuries leave a void. Excavations of once great Roman cities reveal continuity up to the early 600s, then a long quiet, followed suddenly by the 10th century's bustle of new construction. The layers of soil seem to leap forward, skipping centuries as if time itself had been folded shut like a book. Where are the towns that should have risen, fallen and risen again? Where are the tools, the evolving pottery styles, the gradual changes in burial rites? Instead, archaeologists often encounter abrupt shifts, a Roman tradition here, then centuries later, fully medieval artifact. Illig claimed that what archaeologists see as poor preservation or lost records is actually proof that those centuries were never lived. We are not looking at decay, we are looking at absence. But archaeologists are not silent in this battle. They argue that the so-called gaps are real, but not fraudulent. The centuries Illig dismisses were a time of collapse, of fragmented kingdoms, of poverty and war. People built less, wrote less, and left less behind, not because they never existed, but because their lives were small, fleeting, fragile. A farmer scratching at barren soil leaves fewer monuments than an emperor raising cathedrals. This is why we call it the Dark Ages, they say, not because they were erased, but because they left so little light. Still, Illig's supporters are not convinced. They point to specific cases, like Aachen Cathedral, supposedly built in 1805 yet strangely advanced in design, or the city of Magdeburg, which appears in written sources centuries before archaeology finds any trace of it. To them these are not signs of poverty, but signs of backdated invention. The battlefield of ruins remains contested. Every broken shard of pottery, every faint trace in the soil, becomes either a quiet whisper of reality, or a silent confirmation of illusion. And in that silence, the phantom time hypothesis continues to breathe. If archaeology is silent, then surely manuscripts should speak. And yet in the centuries Illig marked as phantom, the written record becomes just as suspicious. Most of what we know about the so-called Dark Ages comes from copies made centuries later. The annals of the Carolingians, the biographies of Charlemagne, even papal decrees, very few survive in original form. Instead, monks of the later Middle Ages tell us what earlier monks supposedly wrote. But where are the originals? Where are the fragile parchments penned in the 7th or 8th century hand? In many cases they are gone. To Illig, this was not accident but design. By creating manuscripts in later centuries and attributing them to an earlier time, the Church and its allies could construct an artificial history. The smooth Latin, the careful structure, the oddly modern phrasing in some texts, all suggested forgery, or at least retroactive invention. The Carolingian minuscule, that elegant script said to emerge in Charlemagne's court, seemed to appear fully formed, like Athena springing from Zeus's head. For Illig, it was the handwriting of conspiracy. Mainstream historians counter that copying was simply the way knowledge survived. Parchment decays, ink fades, fire consumes. Monks did not seek to forge but to preserve, rewriting older texts into newer forms. But Illig pointed to a troubling pattern. These so-called copies often harmonized with each other too perfectly, as though composed in unison. Centuries later, it is not the diversity of independent voices, but the echo of a single scribe's hand across generations. Some of the most famous chronicles of the early medieval period, like the Royal Frankish Annals, are suspiciously neat. They describe Charlemagne's victories with divine precision, yet gloss over defeats or contradictions. Was this history, or propaganda dressed as memory? Illig argued that history, when too polished, is not history at all, it is theatre, and the monks of the later Middle Ages may have been less guardians of memory than stagehands, lowering curtains and raising backdrops to create centuries that never truly stood upon the earth. Relics, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, scraps of holy garments, were among the most prized treasures of medieval Europe. Pilgrims walked hundreds of miles just to glimpse them, and entire cathedrals were built to house them. Yet Illig noticed something strange. Many of the most celebrated relics first appear in written records during the very centuries he believed were fabricated. The 8th and 9th centuries are filled with sudden discoveries of sacred objects, often conveniently legitimizing new churches or monasteries. Why, Illig asked, do these relics emerge from silence precisely in the centuries that may never have existed? Consider the sudden proliferation of pieces of the true cross. By the 9th century, so many splinters were circulating across Europe that, as one critic quipped, there was enough wood to build a ship. And yet records of these relics before the 7th century are far fewer. To Illig, this was not faith blossoming, but forgery expanding, part of the same process that manufactured saints, heroes and emperors to fill a void in the timeline. The relics gave weight to centuries that might never have been lived. The saints of the so-called phantom centuries tell a similar story. Hagiographies, the biographies of saints, appear suddenly in great numbers during the 8th and 9th centuries. These texts, supposedly recounting miraculous lives, are again mostly preserved in later copies, their details polished, their miracles spectacular, their historical anchors vague. Did these saints truly live then, or were they retroactively placed in a time that needed heroes and martyrs? Artifacts too complicate the picture. Coins bearing the faces of phantom rulers, relics attributed to phantom battles, churches whose foundations resist dating, all seem to cluster around this disputed era. Mainstream historians say this is coincidence, the natural fog of antiquity, but Illig insisted that when coincidence accumulates, it becomes pattern. To him these relics and saints were not the glow of faith, but the scaffolding of invention, giving flesh and blood to centuries that may have been nothing more than paper and ink. At first glance, the phantom time hypothesis seems like a historical curiosity, a puzzle about kings, calendars and missing ruins. But Illig and his followers saw something bigger, a challenge to the very nature of time. For most of us, history feels fixed, an arrow pointing backward into a clear and ordered past. But Illig argued that what we call time is not absolute, it is constructed, mediated, recorded by fallible human hands. If those hands can invent centuries, then time itself is not an objective river, but a story written by scribes, kings and priests.
This perspective unsettled even those who dismissed Illig's conclusions. If our calendars can be manipulated, then what anchors us? Every anniversary, every century, every sacred year, what if all of it is fragile? Imagine waking tomorrow to discover that it is not 2025 but 1725, that the modern age did not stand on 1,000 years of progress but on barely 700, that the medieval ruins we admire were not ancient but recent. The ground beneath our feet would feel less like stone and more like shifting sand. Historians responded by emphasizing continuity. Even if records are sparse, they argued, there are enough threads, Byzantine chronicles, Islamic texts, Chinese dynastic histories to confirm that the centuries Illig erased did in fact exist. But Illig pushed the argument beyond history into philosophy. What if continuity itself is an illusion? What if we only perceive smooth transitions because our sources have been curated to show us one, just as a filmmaker cuts out errors to create a seamless movie? Perhaps generations of scribes cut and rearranged the past until it appeared solid, even if beneath the surface it was stitched together like a patchwork cloak. To believe in phantom time, Illig said, was not simply to question 3 centuries, it was to question the very reliability of history as a discipline. For if 300 years can be inserted, why not 30? Why not how much of the theft we carry in our books, our schools, our memories is truly lived, and how much is phantom? At first, Illig's ideas lived in the margins of academic debate, published in small journals, discussed at conferences, dismissed by mainstream historians. But over time, the phantom time hypothesis broke free of scholarly circles and slipped into the bloodstream of popular culture. Alternative historians, conspiracy theorists, and curious outsiders began to embrace it, not necessarily as fact but as a symbol, a reminder that history, like all stories, can be manipulated. Soon, Illig's theory was no longer just about missing centuries, it was about distrust of institutions, distrust of experts, distrust of the very structures that claim to preserve truth. The theory found fertile soil in a world already suspicious of authority. If governments lie, if corporations manipulate, why not historians too? Online forums, books with sensational titles, late-night radio shows, all picked up the idea, turning phantom time into a cultural ghost story. For some, it was thrilling to imagine that the year was not 2025 but 1725. For others, it was comforting. If 300 years were fabricated, then perhaps our problems were not as old, not as heavy, not as insurmountable as they seemed. Of course, with popularization came exaggeration. Some claimed the missing centuries were not a European invention, but the result of alien intervention, time manipulation by forces beyond human comprehension. Others tied the theory to secret societies, suggesting the Vatican or the Freemasons had deliberately engineered phantom time to control humanity's perception of history. Illig himself never embraced these extremes. He saw himself as a historian, not a mystic, but once released, ideas cannot be contained. The phantom time hypothesis became less about dates and calendars, and more about the fragility of reality. If time can be faked, what else can? If centuries can be invented, can memories, nations, even identities be illusions? In the echo chambers of internet forums, the theory grew like wildfire, not because it was proven but because it gave people permission to doubt, and doubt, once planted, spreads faster than any fact. As the phantom time hypothesis spread beyond Illig's own circle, historians sharpened their defenses. They argued that archaeology, far from silent, contained abundant evidence of the so-called missing centuries. Pottery styles, burial methods, and layers of settlement could be traced without interruption from the fall of Rome into the High Middle Ages. Radiocarbon dating and dendrochronology, the science of tree rings, offered additional anchors, placing artifacts firmly within the 7th, 8th and 9th centuries. For example, wooden beams from churches in Germany dated precisely to the 8th century, contradicting Illig's claim that those years never existed. To historians, this was proof that time had not been fabricated, but lived. They also pointed to Islamic history. The Abbasid Caliphate, flourishing in Baghdad during the 8th and 9th centuries, left behind texts, coins, and architecture that remain to this day. The invention of algebra, the translations of Greek philosophy into Arabic, the House of Wisdom, all of these achievements supposedly occurred during Illig's phantom era. Were they to be erased as well? For mainstream scholarship, the hypothesis failed the moment it tried to look beyond Western Europe. Illig, however, remained stubborn. He argued that radiocarbon dating is not perfect, often influenced by calibration curves, while tree ring sequences contain gaps that might themselves be the result of later assumptions. To him, these sciences were built on the very historical framework he questioned, making them circular proofs. As for the Abbasids, the Byzantines, and the Tang dynasty in China, Illig did not deny their existence. Instead, he suggested that their timelines had been bent to match Europe's fabricated centuries, shifted backward to give the illusion of global synchronicity. Mainstream historians found this evasive, a theory that explains away every contradiction by calling it adjustment. One critic wrote, "Is no longer history but belief." Yet, Illig's followers countered that belief is exactly what mainstream history demands. Belief in sources written by men with agendas, belief in institutions that preserve continuity, belief in a timeline that few ever question. And so the debate sharpened, not a war of facts but of trust. Do we trust the stones, the stars, the records, or do we trust the possibility that even these can be rearranged by power? Why do people believe in phantom time? Why does the idea of missing centuries hold such power, even when evidence stacks against it? Part of the answer lies in the human mind's hunger for mystery. History, when presented as a seamless story, can feel dull and inevitable, like a river that simply flowed. But when cracks appear, gaps, anomalies, unexplained silences, the imagination rushes in. The thought that 300 years could have been fabricated offers a thrill, a sense of hidden knowledge that only a few dare to see. To believe in phantom time is to feel like you've slipped behind the curtain, glimpsing the stagehands moving props while the audience remains entranced. There is also the allure of rebellion. Accepting the hypothesis is not just about history, it is about rejecting authority. If experts insist the timeline is fixed, then questioning it becomes an act of defiance, a declaration of independence from institutions that demand trust. In this way, phantom time functions like a secret doorway, not only to the past but to freedom in the present. Psychologists note that conspiracy theories often thrive where trust is weak, and Illig's theory arrived at a moment of cultural doubt. The late 20th century was an age of skepticism, Watergate, Cold War secrecy, growing distrust in governments and institutions. Against this backdrop, the phantom time hypothesis resonated not as fact but as metaphor. It symbolized the suspicion that our leaders, our teachers, our very calendars might be hiding something. Even for those who did not fully believe, the theory offered a kind of poetic truth, that history is never objective, that the past is fragile, but memory can be manipulated. In this sense, phantom time is less a scientific hypothesis and more a mirror of our fears. We do not just fear missing centuries, we fear that the stories holding our world together, our nations, our faiths, our identities, may be stitched together as carefully and as artificially as those phantom years. If the past can be bent, what does that mean for the future? This is where the phantom time hypothesis becomes more than an academic curiosity. Illig suggested that if entire centuries can be invented, written into existence with ink and power, then the very concept of progress becomes questionable. We imagine ourselves as standing on the shoulders of 1,000 years of development, from Rome to the Renaissance to today. But if 300 of those years never happened, then our story is shorter, more fragile, and far less inevitable than we assume. That realization unsettles the way we think about the future. If history itself is constructed, then the future too might be shaped less by reality than by narrative. Predictions, prophecies, timelines. Are they simply another layer of illusion, waiting to be written by those who control the pen? For Illig's followers, phantom time was not only about lost centuries, it was about the possibility that we are living in a script still being edited, the next chapter already half-drafted by powers we cannot see. This is why some people find the theory liberating, even empowering. If centuries can be fabricated, then perhaps the future is not a fixed road but a malleable path, one that can be rewritten just as easily as the past. For others, it is terrifying, the idea that our entire existence rests on unstable foundations, that we are walking across a bridge suspended over nothing.
Historians dismiss Illig's theory as fringe, but its cultural shadow lingers precisely because it touches something deeper than dates. It forces us to ask whether progress, destiny, and even civilization itself are as solid as we assume. If phantom centuries exist in our past, then phantom decades may already lie in our future, and perhaps when we look back centuries from now, people will wonder, how much of the 21st century was truly lived, and how much was phantom? For Heribert Illig, the phantom time hypothesis was never just a playful thought experiment. It was a lifetime of work, a relentless battle against the weight of mainstream history. When his book Das Erfundene Mittelalter, The Invented Middle Ages, appeared in 1991, it caused a storm in German intellectual circles. Some critics mocked him as a crank. Others accused him of attacking the very foundations of European identity. Universities largely ignored him, refusing to debate what they considered absurd. Yet Illig pressed on. He held conferences, published papers, and built a small but passionate following. To Illig, the resistance only proved his point. Institutions cling to their narratives, unwilling to question the timelines that legitimize their power. He often remarked that history was treated less like science and more like religion, a faith in continuity, guarded by priests in academic robes. His hypothesis, radical as it was, forced people to confront how fragile the discipline could be. And even as he aged, Illig remained convinced, somewhere in the records, in the silence of missing centuries, the truth was still waiting. But history is not kind to heretics. Illig's theory was dissected, dismantled and ridiculed in scholarly journals. Archaeologists pointed to radiocarbon dating, astronomers to eclipse data, linguists to the evolution of language across those centuries. Each field in its own way rejected phantom time. Illig's reputation in mainstream academia never recovered. Yet outside those walls, his idea lived a second life. Alternative historians wove it into books and documentaries. YouTube channels dissected his claims, and internet forums kept the debate alive. By the 2000s, Illig himself grew quieter, but the ghost of phantom time no longer needed its author. It had become folklore, a story retold, reshaped, debated, dismissed and resurrected. Whether Illig was right or wrong seemed less important than the questions he forced us to ask. What if our past is not what it seems? What if the calendar itself is a construction, a fragile agreement we mistake for truth? In that sense, Illig achieved what few historians ever do. He made the past feel alive, uncertain, and dangerous again. Even if one rejects every detail of Illig's argument, the phantom time hypothesis lingers like a parable. It suggests that time, the very fabric of our lives, may not be as linear or trustworthy as we believe. Myths have always played with this idea. Golden ages lost, years stolen by gods, ages of darkness erased from memory. Illig's theory is in many ways a modern myth, a story that tells us less about history and more about our fear that the past is unstable. When people share the hypothesis online, they rarely present it as fact. Instead, it functions like a thought experiment, a lens that reveals how much of history depends on trust. We cannot personally verify eclipses from 700 AD, or carbon date a cathedral beam. We rely on others, and so, phantom time speaks to a deeper unease, that the stories holding us together might be illusions, carefully arranged to make sense of chaos. Whether invented by Otto III, the Church, or by our own modern anxieties, the missing centuries become a metaphor for the fragility of memory itself. This is why the idea refuses to die. Like Atlantis or the Holy Grail, phantom time has become a symbol of hidden truth, a possibility that there is more beneath the surface than official history admits. For some, it is a cautionary tale about trusting authority. For others, it is a reminder that history is not static but alive, contested, shifting. And for a few, it is almost spiritual, the thought that humanity may not be as old as it thinks, that our story is shorter, more immediate, and perhaps more urgent. Even Illig himself hinted at this symbolic weight. In one interview he said, "If I am wrong, then at least I have shown how little we truly know." And that, perhaps, is the true legacy of phantom time, not the erasure of centuries, but the refusal to accept history as untouchable. Like all myths, its power lies not in proof, but in the questions it plants, and once planted, those questions do not fade, they wait, like seeds in the soil of time, ready to sprout whenever doubt takes root. The phantom time hypothesis does not stand alone. Across history, anomalies in the measurement of time have always unsettled scholars. Consider the Gregorian calendar reform of 1582, when Pope Gregory XIII corrected the drift of the Julian calendar by skipping 10 full days. October 4th was followed not by October 5th, but October 15th. For Illig, this was proof that calendars are not natural but constructed, subject to adjustment or manipulation. If 10 days could vanish overnight, why not 3 centuries across centuries of copying and power struggles? Others point to the gaps in the archaeological record of civilizations like the Maya, or the sudden collapses of cultures whose timelines remain uncertain. Historians often debate whether these gaps are due to catastrophe, miscalculation, or simple absence of evidence. For Illig's followers, such uncertainties confirm that time is elastic, stretched and folded by both natural events and human error. Phantom time is not an isolated fantasy, it belongs to a long lineage of puzzles, where chronology itself becomes unstable. Some even connect the theory with physics. Einstein taught us that time is relative, not absolute. Quantum mechanics suggests time may be granular, not continuous. In popular imagination, this scientific strangeness feeds the allure of phantom time. If the universe itself bends time, why couldn't humans bend history's time? The hypothesis becomes a bridge between the historical and the cosmic, a reminder that what we call centuries are only markers, fragile scaffolding erected to make sense of an infinite mystery. But mainstream historians caution against mixing metaphors. They argue that while physics may bend space-time, history's timeline is anchored by artifacts, ruins, and records. And yet, Illig's followers smile at this distinction. To them, history is just another kind of physics experiment, one where the data can be skewed, the measurements recalibrated, the story retold. In the end, the question is not whether phantom time is real, but whether time itself is something we can ever fully trust. The phantom time hypothesis did not only spark academic rebuttals, it also provoked laughter. Historians, journalists, even comedians found it irresistible as satire. University lecturers would joke that if the 8th century never existed, then their students were free from having to memorize Charlemagne for the exam. Online memes declared birthdays 3 centuries earlier than expected. Happy 1725 became a running joke in some corners of the internet. For skeptics, humor was the sharpest weapon. To laugh at phantom time was to strip it of authority, to reveal it as nothing more than a fringe curiosity dressed up as scholarship. The mockery grew because the idea itself was audacious. To deny an entire stretch of history, emperors, battles, plagues, inventions, felt absurd. And so skeptics leaned into the absurdity, exaggerating it for comic effect. If centuries could be invented, why not dinosaurs? Why not Shakespeare? Why not Last Tuesday? Humor became the mainstream's way of insulating itself from the unsettling possibility that Illig might have struck a nerve. But for believers, ridicule was not defeat, it was fuel. They saw in the laughter the very resistance Illig had warned about. Institutions and their defenders mocking what they could not disprove. Every joke about phantom time was reinterpreted as evidence of a deeper fear. Why mock so loudly, if the idea were truly harmless? In conspiracy circles, ridicule is never the end of a theory, it is the sign that the theory has touched a nerve, that the mainstream feels threatened. Thus the laughter became a badge of honor. Believers shared memes not as insults, but as banners, proof that phantom time had entered the cultural bloodstream. For them, every sneer from a historian was a reminder that questioning the official story always comes at a cost. And so the debate did not fade with ridicule. Instead it hardened, transforming Illig's hypothesis from an academic theory into a cultural fault line, one side laughing, the other defiant, both locked in a battle not just over history, but over who controls the story of time itself. Religion is where the phantom time hypothesis takes on its most haunting weight. For Illig, one of the strongest motives behind the invention of centuries was the obsession with the millennium, the year 1000. In Christian thought, this year carried immense symbolic power, the turning of an age, the possible return of Christ, the dawn of apocalypse. To reach that year was to pass a cosmic threshold, and yet by the 7th century, humanity was still far from it. What if, Illig suggested. Rulers like Otto III and Pope Sylvester II longed to live in the age of prophecy, to see themselves as the chosen figures guiding Christendom into its 1000th year. By inserting 3 centuries, they could accelerate destiny. The year 1000 would not belong to distant descendants, but to them. Otto III could proclaim himself not merely an emperor but an emperor of the new millennium. The Church could declare itself the fulfillment of prophecy, standing at the very hinge of time. For Illig, this ambition explained everything. The missing centuries were not a clerical error, but a theological hunger, a desire to bend history until it matched the calendar of God. Mainstream historians find this unlikely. They argue that medieval Europe did not in fact obsess over the year 1000 as much as later writers claimed. Many peasants and nobles barely marked it, no mass panic swept the continent. But Illig countered that absence of panic is precisely the point. The millennium had already been engineered into existence. The rulers of Christendom had staged history so that their reign aligned with prophecy, leaving no need for hysteria. To believers in phantom time, this explanation carried an almost poetic symmetry. If the apocalypse did not come at the year 1000, perhaps it was because the year itself was a fabrication. Perhaps we had not truly crossed that threshold at all. Perhaps we are still waiting. In this way, phantom time blurs the line between history and eschatology, between missing centuries and missing endings. And for some, the theory is less about Otto III or Charlemagne than about a chilling possibility. What if we are not living in the 21st century at all, but in a delayed age, our true millennium still to come? If human scribes can lie, surely the heavens cannot. This is the argument historians often raise against Illig's hypothesis. The stars are impartial witnesses. Ancient records describe eclipses, comets, and planetary alignments, events so precise that modern astronomers can calculate exactly when they occurred. And these records, from Europe, Byzantium and the Islamic world, fit neatly into the conventional timeline. An eclipse mentioned in a Byzantine chronicle dated 840 AD corresponds perfectly with astronomical models. A comet cited in Chinese records aligns with the same year described in European annals. For historians, this is the unshakable anchor. The sky does not lie. Illig, however, was not convinced. He argued that many of these astronomical records are themselves copies, preserved centuries after the events they supposedly describe. If monks or scribes fabricated the years, they could just as easily adjust the eclipses to match, inserting celestial events retroactively. The question then becomes, are the heavens telling us the truth, or are we merely reading the heavens through manuscripts already touched by human hands? Critics pressed further. They pointed to dendrochronology, the tree ring method of dating, which provides a natural, year-by-year record of climate and growth. In those rings, the years of volcanic eruptions, droughts and cold snaps leave indelible marks, and these too align with the conventional calendar, not Illig's shortened one. To dismiss this, Illig had to suggest that even the calibration of these scientific tools was contaminated by historical assumptions. In other words, science itself was trapped in the same web of error that phantom time sought to expose. For mainstream scholars, this was the breaking point. A theory that can explain away every contradiction by claiming that all methods are corrupted begins to resemble faith more than science. And yet for Illig's followers, this was exactly the appeal. If even the stars, the trees and the soil can be questioned, then nothing is beyond doubt. The phantom time hypothesis becomes less about proof and more about posture, a radical skepticism that refuses to bow to any authority, even that of the cosmos itself. By the time the phantom time hypothesis had settled into the public imagination, it was clear the debate was no longer just about missing centuries. It had become a collision of philosophies. On one side stood the institutions of history, universities, museums, scientific dating methods, all rooted in trust, in the belief that evidence, when carefully studied, builds truth. On the other side stood Illig and his followers, who argued that those very institutions are built on fragile foundations, and that to trust them is to risk being deceived. This divide mirrors a broader cultural struggle. In a world where faith in experts weakens, where misinformation spreads, and where suspicion often outweighs certainty, phantom time became a symbol of resistance. It was not about proving or disproving eclipses. It was about choosing whether to believe the gatekeepers of knowledge, or to stand defiantly outside their walls. To believe in phantom time was to say, the fortress of history is not as impenetrable as it looks. For mainstream historians, this was deeply frustrating. They saw the hypothesis as a virus of doubt, corroding public trust in scholarship. But for believers, the very resistance was proof of its power. If history is so strong, one Illig supporter wrote, why does it fear a single question? And that is the essence of the clash. Institutions seek stability, continuity, certainty. Radical doubt thrives on disruption, fracture, uncertainty. In the end, phantom time survives not because it is proven, but because it gives voice to something many people already feel, that the past is less secure, less stable than they were taught. And in a strange way, both sides are right. History does require trust, and doubt does reveal cracks. The hypothesis lives precisely in that tension, refusing to let either side fully win. History is never neutral. It is the stage on which nations justify their existence, where rulers claim legitimacy, where cultures root their pride. And this is why the phantom time hypothesis struck such a nerve in Europe. By erasing Charlemagne and the early medieval empire, Illig was not just questioning dates, he was questioning identity. Charlemagne, after all, is celebrated as the father of Europe, a unifying figure claimed by both France and Germany as part of their national story. Remove him, and you shake the symbolic foundation of the continent itself. This is why many historians reacted with more than annoyance. They reacted with hostility. To deny those centuries was to deny the genealogy of kingdoms, the birth of modern Europe, the legitimacy of power that still echoes in parliaments and churches today. History, Illig revealed, is not just memory, it is currency, and to suggest 3 centuries were fabricated was like counterfeiting the money of nations. At the same time, phantom time found strange political uses. Some fringe nationalist groups embraced the theory, arguing that if the Middle Ages were partly invented, then so too were certain borders, alliances, and rivalries. If history can be rewritten once, why not again? Others used it as a weapon against the Church, framing the papacy as a master of deception. Illig himself denied political motives, but the theory became entangled in debates over what it meant to be European. Was Europe the heir of 1,000 unbroken years of progress, or was it a story crafted by rulers to make their authority seem ancient? In this way, phantom time became more than chronology. It became a mirror of Europe's struggle with its past, proud, fractured, and never entirely certain of its own origins.
Even outside of history books, the phantom time hypothesis seeped into the imagination of artists and writers. The idea of missing centuries is inherently cinematic. Shadows, erased kingdoms, forgotten empires. Novelists toyed with it, creating worlds where the calendar itself was a lie, where characters lived in an age that should not exist. In speculative fiction, entire trilogies have been built around the idea that the Middle Ages were a staged performance, a theatre of illusions cast upon humanity. Visual artists too have played with the concept. Installations showing empty museum displays, timelines with blank spaces, and calendars with torn-out pages evoke the ghost of phantom years. For them, Illig's theory is less about proof than about metaphor, a reminder that absence can be as powerful as presence, that what is not seen, not recorded, can shape culture as profoundly as what is preserved. Cinema and television have also flirted with the idea. Documentaries explore it half seriously, mixing suspenseful narration with skeptical commentary. Historical dramas occasionally nod to it in playful subplots, a character whispering that these centuries never happened. And in online culture, phantom time thrives as a meme. Timelines collapsing, Charlemagne fading like a ghost in a glitching simulation. The appeal is obvious. Our modern age is obsessed with hidden truths and alternate realities, from the Matrix to simulation theory. Phantom time fits neatly into this zeitgeist. It offers a story where history itself is a simulation, where kings and popes are actors on a stage whose script was written centuries after the fact. Whether as art, entertainment, or satire, the hypothesis has become part of the cultural fabric, a ghost story not of haunted castles but of haunted calendars. Before the internet, the phantom time hypothesis lived mostly in German academic and fringe circles, debated in books and small conferences. But with the rise of online forums in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the theory escaped its borders. Suddenly, people in America, Asia and beyond were encountering Illig's claims, often stripped of their technical details and reshaped into bold headlines, 3 centuries never happened. On message boards like Usenet, later on Reddit and conspiracy forums, the hypothesis thrived, not because it convinced, but because it provoked. It was easy to summarize, easy to spread, and endlessly debatable. The internet is fertile soil for ideas that challenge authority. Here, every user could play historian, debating timelines with as much passion as professionals, and phantom time became a kind of intellectual playground. Some argued sincerely, others sarcastically, but all engaged with the idea that history might not be what it seems. The hypothesis gained a second life not as scholarship but as content, a meme, a thread, a debate sparking thousands of comments. As social media grew, so did phantom time's reach. YouTube videos with dramatic music and shadowy visuals claim to reveal the missing centuries. TikTok creators condensed the theory into 60-second bursts, while Wikipedia editors fought over how much space it deserved. Each platform reshaped the hypothesis. YouTube made it cinematic, Reddit made it ironic, TikTok made it viral. In this digital afterlife, the phantom time hypothesis ceased to be Illig alone. It became a folk theory of the internet, standing alongside flat Earth, simulation theory, and Mandela effect as part of the great catalogue of cultural doubt. For younger generations encountering it online, it didn't matter whether the theory was true. What mattered was the thrill of questioning everything, of realizing that even something as solid as a calendar might be fragile, written by men and open to suspicion. Whenever phantom time is discussed online, it often gets lumped together with other fringe ideas: flat Earth, hollow Earth, ancient aliens, the Mandela effect. But there is a subtle difference. Most conspiracies attack the structure of reality itself, the shape of the planet, the nature of memory, the existence of extraterrestrials. Phantom time, by contrast, attacks something quieter but perhaps more intimate: the story we tell about our past. It does not deny the existence of the sun, the moon, or gravity. It denies the continuity of history. That distinction is why some who reject flat Earth or alien pyramids still find phantom time intriguing. It doesn't force you to abandon science. It forces you to abandon certainty. To imagine that centuries could vanish is not to rewrite physics, but to reveal how fragile memory, institutions, and trust really are. That subtlety makes the theory stickier than its peers, harder to laugh away completely. The Mandela effect provides a closer cousin. Both ideas play on the fear that collective memory can be wrong, that what we know with certainty might be false. But where the Mandela effect blames glitches in reality or parallel universes, phantom time blames power, emperors, popes, institutions bending the record to their will. That difference shifts the theory from science fiction into politics, making it feel less fantastical and more sinister. Flat Earth can be dismissed with a photograph. The Mandela effect can be dismissed with psychology. But phantom time lingers, because its battlefield is not the sky or the mind, but history itself, a field already shaped by silences, erasures, and reinterpretations. In this way, the hypothesis is less like a wild conspiracy and more like an extreme form of historical revisionism, the ultimate version of asking, what if everything you learned in school was wrong? Ironically, while most professional historians dismiss the phantom time hypothesis as baseless, some have found it useful in the classroom. Professors of medieval studies or archaeology occasionally present Illig's theory to students, not to endorse it, but to test their critical skills. Imagine being told on your first day of class that the years 6114 to 914 never happened. The shock sparks curiosity. Students are forced to ask, what counts as evidence? How do we know time is real? In this way, phantom time becomes a perfect case study in historical methodology. Teachers walk students through dendrochronology, radiocarbon dating, cross-cultural chronicles, numismatics, and art history, showing how independent sources anchor the timeline. By confronting a radical doubt, learners come to appreciate the scaffolding of history itself. In that sense, Illig has become an unintentional ally to historians. His skepticism gives them a stage to demonstrate how history defends itself. But the lesson cuts both ways, for while phantom time is debunked in the classroom, it also leaves a residue, the awareness that history is always constructed. Students leave not just knowing that Illig was wrong, but realizing how fragile timelines really are, how much we rely on trust, calibration, interpretation. One medievalist wrote, "I assign Illig's text every year, not because it is true, but because it reminds my students that history is not a list of facts. It is an argument about the past." In this sense, phantom time has carved a strange niche. A failed theory, yes, but one that lives on as pedagogy, a ghost haunting classrooms, making young minds wrestle with questions that outlast the theory itself. And perhaps that is the deepest irony. Even when disproven, phantom time continues to create time for itself. One of the strongest challenges to the phantom time hypothesis comes not from Europe itself, but from beyond it. While Illig framed his argument around the Holy Roman Empire, Byzantium, and the papacy, other civilizations were keeping their own careful records. In China, dynastic histories were compiled with precision, tracking eclipses, famines, and court events year by year. These records align smoothly with the phantom centuries of Europe. The Tang dynasty, flourishing during Illig's missing period, left behind poetry, inventions, and architecture that still stand. If phantom time were real, we would have to believe that Chinese history too had been fabricated in sync with Europe, a global conspiracy with no evidence of coordination. The Islamic world offers a similar rebuttal. From Baghdad to Cordoba, scholars of the Islamic Golden Age preserved manuscripts, astronomical data, and medical treatises. Their works not only survive but influenced later European thought. To erase phantom centuries in Europe, one would have to erase them in the Islamic calendar as well, an impossible task, since Islamic dating follows its own lunar system independent of Christian reforms. In short, the missing centuries are visible elsewhere, making their absence in Europe implausible. Yet, Illig's supporters often flip this argument. They claim that the existence of independent records only proves how wide the deception must have been. If European rulers invented time, they argue, then scribes elsewhere may have unknowingly adopted those same errors when synchronizing calendars with Christian or Byzantine envoys. To mainstream historians, this is grasping at straws. To believers, it is proof of how deep the manipulation runs. What this reveals is not a flaw in chronology, but a difference in mindset. Historians see cross-cultural corroboration as the strongest evidence against phantom time. Conspiracists see it as the strongest evidence for it, imagining a global web of hidden hands. Thus, the debate stretches far beyond Europe. It becomes a question of worldview. Do you trust the harmony of records across civilizations as proof of stability, or do you see in that harmony the fingerprints of an invisible editor of history? Archaeology is often presented as the nail in the coffin for phantom time. The ground, after all, does not lie. Excavations across Europe have uncovered layers of pottery, bones, coins, and ruins that fit neatly into the disputed centuries. Carolingian palaces, Byzantine fortifications, Islamic architecture in Spain, all point to a world that existed between 614 and 911. Radiocarbon dating, tree rings, and stratigraphy add layers of confirmation. To mainstream scholars, this is overwhelming. The earth itself testifies against Illig, yet Illig countered that much of medieval archaeology is fragmentary, ambiguous, and subject to interpretation. A coin found in a field may be dated to the 8th century, but through inscriptions copied from earlier rulers, through styles that might be retroactively assigned. He argued that archaeologists often work backward, fitting discoveries into an established timeline instead of letting the artifacts speak freely. If the timeline itself is flawed, then the artifacts may simply be misplaced puzzle pieces, forced into the wrong frame. Consider coins, often treated as the most reliable anchors of chronology.
Charlemagne's likeness appears on thousands of silver deniers dated across his reign. For Illig, this was not proof but problem. If Charlemagne himself never existed, then the coins were forgeries, created centuries later to retroactively legitimize an invented empire. Mainstream historians scoff at this, pointing to the sheer number of coins unearthed across multiple regions as evidence of circulation. Illig responded, forgers had centuries to scatter them, embedding the fiction into the soil itself. This tension reveals the heart of the debate. Archaeology is not raw truth, it is interpretation. A coin, a shard, a ruin. These are fragments, silent until someone names them, dates them, places them in sequence. For most, this process affirms history. For Illig's followers, it proves how fragile the scaffolding is. Archaeology becomes not the death of phantom time, but its stage, a battlefield where skeptics see solidity and believers see manipulation. If stones can be debated, words can be doubted even more. Much of Illig's argument rested on manuscripts, or rather their absence. Between 600 and 900 AD, the surviving body of European documents is noticeably thin compared to other eras. Few chronicles, fewer letters, and almost no original charters survive in their first form. Instead, most of what we know comes from later copies, recopied by monks in the centuries that followed. To Illig, this was not coincidence. This was the fingerprint of invention. If the centuries themselves were fabricated, of course the manuscripts would be missing. Of course the originals would not exist. He pointed to famous texts, like the Royal Frankish Annals, which only survive in later versions with suspiciously convenient accounts of Charlemagne's glory. Were these authentic memories of the 8th century, or products of a 10th century scriptoria eager to pad the timeline? Illig's suspicion was simple: silence is not neutral. It speaks, and what it speaks is absence. Mainstream scholars counter that the darkness of the early Middle Ages is well known, not because it never happened but because literacy and stability collapsed after Rome's fall. Wars, migrations, and economic decline left few scribes to record events and fewer libraries to preserve them. The missing manuscripts, they argue, reflect chaos, not conspiracy. But Illig pressed the point. Even in times of turmoil, he said, we find records elsewhere, in Byzantium, in the Islamic world, in China. Why should Europe alone fall so silent? Why should centuries of Christian expansion leave so little trace? To him, the scarcity was not random, it was engineered, and thus the libraries of Europe became suspect, not just vaults of memory, but factories of narrative, places where monks were less chroniclers than architects of an artificial past. At its core, the phantom time hypothesis is less about coins, manuscripts, or eclipses, and more about the philosophy of history. What happens when we admit that memory can be fabricated, that centuries might be scripted rather than lived? For Illig, the hypothesis was not only a chronological claim, it was a warning. History is not a transparent window to the past. It is a construction. Each chronicle is an act of editing. Each monument is a statement of power. Each date is a decision about what counts as time. In this light, phantom time becomes almost allegorical. Whether or not centuries were truly invented, the idea dramatizes a truth historians already know. History is never neutral. It is shaped by the victors, the rulers, the scribes who chose which stories to copy and which to let decay. Illig merely pushed this reality to its extreme, asking what if they did not just edit stories but time itself? Philosophers of history like Michel Foucault or Hayden White might have disagreed with Illig's methods, but they would recognize his question. For them, the past is not simply what happened, but what is narrated as having happened. In this sense, phantom time is a parable about narrative power. To invent 3 centuries is no different, conceptually, from inventing a hero, erasing a massacre, or sanctifying a king. It is memory made malleable, truth made negotiable. And this is why the theory still echoes, long after its scholarly rejection. It speaks to a modern anxiety. If history is a story, who is telling it, and what parts have they chosen to hide? Even if Illig was wrong about the centuries, his hypothesis pulls us into a deeper truth, that history is not a stone monument, but a trembling manuscript, always at risk of being rewritten. In many ways, the phantom time hypothesis feels strangely prophetic for the digital age. We live in a world where memory is no longer carved in stone but stored in servers, files, and clouds. And just as medieval manuscripts could be copied, altered or destroyed, so too can digital records vanish with a keystroke. If Illig taught us to suspect centuries of parchment, what would he say of terabytes of data, fragile against the forces of censorship, hacking, or simple technological decay? Some theorists argue that phantom time is less about the past than about the present, a warning that all archives, medieval or modern, are vulnerable. If monks could fabricate history by editing manuscripts, what prevents corporations or governments from fabricating memory by editing digital databases? In this sense, Illig's hypothesis feels like a mirror held up to our age of misinformation, reminding us that memory has always been editable, only the tools change. Digital culture itself seems to echo phantom time. Consider the Mandela effect spreading through online forums, or the viral claims that certain movies or events never happened the way people remember. These digital myths, born of glitches in collective memory, function like miniature phantom times, pockets of false pasts. And beyond conspiracy, there is the fragility of digital preservation. What will historians of the future say if vast swathes of 21st century data are lost to obsolescence? Will they declare that phantom decades existed because our cloud servers failed? In this way, phantom time is not just a hypothesis about medieval Europe. It is a metaphor for all societies that entrust their memory to fragile mediums, parchment, papyrus, hard drives or clouds. Time, in the end, is only as real as the record that survives. For most of us, history feels distant, an ocean of dates and names stretching far beyond our lives. But the phantom time hypothesis brings that ocean suddenly close. If 3 centuries can vanish, then history is not a stable backdrop, it is fragile, shifting, uncertain. For some, this sparks liberation. If history can be rewritten, then perhaps our personal lives are not bound by the weight of an unchangeable past. For others, it sparks dread. If even the past is unstable, then what anchors us at all? Ordinary people who stumble upon Illig's idea often report a strange vertigo. It is not that they suddenly believe in phantom time, but that they begin to feel the timeline of their own existence differently. The calendar, once a symbol of certainty, becomes a question mark. Am I truly living in the year 2025, or am I inhabiting a story shaped centuries ago by powers I will never see? This personal dimension explains why the hypothesis endures in internet culture. It is not really about Charlemagne or Otto III, it is about you. If history itself can be fabricated, then what about family histories, national myths, cultural traditions? Phantom time functions like a mirror, reflecting back our deepest insecurity, that the stories we inherit are not always the stories that were lived. For believers, this creates a sense of rebellion, of stepping outside the script written for them. For skeptics, it creates a deeper appreciation for the fragile work of historians, who stitch together fragments so that memory does not collapse. In either case, the effect is intimate. Phantom time is not just a medieval puzzle, it is an existential question. How do we locate ourselves in a past that may itself be a fiction? Beyond history and science, the phantom time hypothesis has found a strange home in philosophy and theology. Thinkers have used it less as a literal claim and more as a metaphor. If entire centuries can be invented, what else in our lives is built on illusion? For philosophers, phantom time echoes Plato's cave, shadows mistaken for reality. For theologians, it recalls Augustine's warning that human time is not God's time, that the calendars of men are but fragile scaffolding around eternity. In this light, Illig's claim becomes almost allegorical, not that 300 years are missing, but that all human history is stitched with gaps, errors, and silences that only divine truth could fill. Some priests even noted that phantom time resembles the Christian concept of original sin. Just as humanity inherited a corruption from its beginning, so too might our calendars carry a corruption at their root. The phantom years would then be a metaphor for humanity's estrangement from perfect truth, a reminder that we live in stories shaped by error, waiting for redemption to reveal what truly happened. Others in modern philosophy connected phantom time with existentialism. If history itself may be fabricated, then meaning cannot be anchored in certainty. We live, as Camus said, in the absurd, seeking clarity in a universe that refuses to guarantee it. In this sense, phantom time is not just about medieval monks, it is about the human condition. We build our identities on timelines, genealogies, calendars, and yet these too may be fragile constructions. To accept this is to stand, trembling, in the same uncertainty Illig invited us to consider. For believers in faith, this uncertainty is a call to trust in God rather than in parchment. For secular thinkers, it is a call to embrace freedom. If even the past is unstable, then we are free to create meaning in the present. Thus, phantom time moves beyond a historical curiosity. It becomes a spiritual and philosophical parable, teaching that the truth of time is less in years and more in how we live them. In many ways, the phantom time hypothesis feels like the plot of The Matrix. What if everything we think we know, our calendars, our history, is not real but a constructed simulation designed to keep us unaware of the true nature of reality? Just as The Matrix presents a world built on illusions, phantom time suggests that our perception of the past is artificially constructed, fabricated by hidden forces. The difference is that while The Matrix presents a digital reality, phantom time suggests that the past itself has been digitally manipulated, erased or redefined, not by machines, but by those who wield control over history. In this sense, Illig's hypothesis functions like a glitch in the fabric of time. It asks us, what if the history we inherit is not real, but a carefully edited story? What if we're living in a world built on constructed memory, no different from a computer simulation, where the real past is hidden from us, only to be discovered later? Simulation theory, which has gained increasing traction in the 21st century, argues that we might be living in a computer-generated reality, where everything we perceive is part of a complex program designed by an advanced civilization. For simulation theorists, the phantom time hypothesis feels like a modern iteration of this ancient question. If history itself can be altered or erased, then our reality is already a construction, not unlike a simulation. What makes the hypothesis so captivating is its almost scientific nature, rather than a cosmic or metaphysical notion. It deals with time itself as a construct, suggesting that humanity's perception of history could be a false memory planted in our collective minds. As simulation theory suggests that a real reality exists beyond our perceived one, phantom time suggests that the true record of the past is something buried under layers of false narratives, waiting for a generation brave enough to ask, what if all of this is a simulation? The phantom time hypothesis, when viewed through the lens of global conspiracies, becomes a story not just about missing centuries, but about the nature of power itself. Conspiracies often stem from the idea that hidden forces manipulate what we know, and in Illig's theory, that force is the rulers of history. If rulers can manipulate time itself, then what else might they be controlling? This is the same logic behind many conspiracy theories, from the idea of secret societies to global financial manipulation. Phantom time taps into our deepest suspicions about the powers that shape our world, reminding us that history is often told by those in control, and that control comes with the ability to define the past as they see fit. Illig's hypothesis goes beyond questioning a specific period in history. It questions the entire structure of historical authority. Who gets to decide what is real? Who gets to decide which stories are worth preserving? And what happens when we realize that those in power might have been creating a narrative rather than documenting an objective truth? In this way, phantom time resonates with critical theory and postmodernism, where knowledge is not neutral but a product of power dynamics. Michel Foucault, in particular, would find Illig's theory fascinating. To him, history is not just a record of events, but a battlefield of competing discourses, and the power to create those discourses, to dictate which narratives survive, is itself the ultimate form of control. Illig's hypothesis suggests that history is not a fixed objective timeline, but a constructed narrative shaped by those with the power to write it. This view forces us to reckon with the idea that the past we know is not just the result of historical fact, but of historical decisions made by powerful figures who shaped the truth according to their interests. Phantom time, in the end, is not just a theoretical challenge to the calendar, it's a reminder of the power embedded in historical narrative, a call to question what we take as given, and to reconsider the stories that have been handed down through the ages. In the end, the phantom time hypothesis is more than a historical curiosity, it is a metaphor for our modern struggle with truth and memory. In an age where information is manipulated at the speed of a keystroke, where facts are contested and narratives fractured, Illig's theory speaks to a deeper fear that what we believe about the past might not be what actually happened. In our digital age, where news is fake one moment and real the next, where history can be rewritten by anyone with access to a blog or social media, the idea that time itself can be fabricated doesn't seem so far-fetched. We live in a world where the past is increasingly in question. People debate the legacy of historical figures, the accuracy of events, and the integrity of recorded facts. Phantom time forces us to face the uncomfortable reality that what we know about our collective history may not be as stable or reliable as we thought. If we can fabricate memory, can we also fabricate the past? What happens when we stop trusting our own recollections, let alone the records of history? And so we return to Illig's central question: what if everything we know is a constructed story, a narrative curated by the few to shape the future of the many? As conspiracy theories grow more prominent and digital technologies allow for deeper manipulation of truth, the phantom time hypothesis becomes more than an oddity. It becomes a warning about the fragility of memory, the power of narrative, and the responsibility we all share in ensuring the past is preserved with integrity. The true lesson of phantom time may not be that centuries were lost, but that in every era time, like truth, is always negotiable, and if we are not careful, we might find ourselves living in a story someone else has written for us, not even knowing the difference between what is real and what has been erased. Phantom time at its core is a call to awaken to the malleability of memory and history, to embrace the uncertainty that comes with it, and to reflect on the very nature of our shared past. As we venture further into the nature of time itself, we encounter a crucial question: can we trust the mechanisms we have built to measure history? The Gregorian calendar that we rely on today is just one of many systems used throughout history, all of them subject to human influence. The hypothesis of phantom time takes this a step further, suggesting that these systems can be intentionally manipulated, whether for religious, political, or ideological reasons. One of the more unsettling aspects of the phantom time hypothesis is the fact that it makes us question not just the accuracy of specific records, but the entire idea of historical continuity. If some periods in history have been fabricated, how do we know that other periods, those we accept as true, are any more reliable? The more we dig into the question of time and history, the more we realize that our understanding of the past is fragile, pieced together like a jigsaw puzzle whose pieces might have been shuffled by someone with a hidden agenda. This realization brings us to the philosophical implications of the phantom time hypothesis. At its core, the theory is a challenge to the way we think about memory, truth, and identity. In a world where truth is increasingly seen as subjective, the question becomes: can we ever know the past? Can we truly grasp the full scope of our collective history? Or are we forever left in the dark, constructing narratives from partial and flawed memories? In many ways, the phantom time hypothesis is a philosophical experiment, a thought experiment that forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge. It asks us to acknowledge the possibility that the truth about history may not be as straightforward as we think. By questioning the fabric of time itself, Illig forces us to rethink our entire relationship with the past, with truth, and with how we tell our own stories.
The implications of the phantom time hypothesis stretch far beyond the realm of academia. This theory disrupts the societal consensus we've built around time and history. If the years 6114 to 911 were fabricated, what does that say about the systems of power that govern how we understand our place in the world? The calendar is more than a tool for scheduling. It is a social contract, a shared understanding that binds us to a collective narrative of progress, decline, and civilization. By challenging that contract, the phantom time hypothesis forces us to confront the fragility of our cultural foundations. If history is constructed, who is responsible for maintaining this illusion and to what end? The very structure of society, from education to politics, from the economy to religion, is built on the assumption that time is. The suggestion that time can be manufactured or erased challenges not only the stories of the past, but the social systems that rely on those stories. This is where phantom time resonates with larger cultural narratives. Every culture has its own relationship with time. The cyclical nature of Eastern philosophies, the linear trajectory of Western thought, and the mythological view of time found in many indigenous cultures. Phantom time cuts across all of these by questioning the very idea of time itself, not as a progression, but as a socially constructed reality. For instance, the Western narrative of time often presents history as a series of linear events that follow a certain path toward progress. We think of the rise of democracy, scientific revolution, or industrialization as markers of advancement, driven by the inexorable passage of time. The phantom time hypothesis disrupts this by introducing the idea that these milestones may not have happened in the way we remember them. If history is constructed rather than discovered, then what happens to our narrative of progress? How do we reconcile this idea of constant evolution with the notion that portions of time may have been deliberately erased or fabricated? The phantom time hypothesis is not just a historical anomaly, it fits squarely within the broader philosophical tradition of questioning objective reality. Throughout history, philosophers have asked whether what we perceive as real is in fact a true reflection of the world. From Descartes' skepticism of the external world to Nietzsche's critique of truth as a human construct, the theory echoes a long-standing philosophical dilemma. If we cannot fully trust our senses, our memories, or our recorded histories, then how can we trust anything at all? The idea that history could be fabricated, that time itself can be bent and shaped, invites us to question the reliability of perception itself. What if our entire experience of the world is a series of constructed narratives? What if the reality we think we know is just a narrative we've been taught to believe, created by forces beyond our comprehension? In this way, phantom time is a direct challenge to epistemology, the study of how we know what we know. This philosophical exploration also ties into modern postmodern thought, which questions the notion of objective truth. Postmodernists argue that all knowledge is subjective, shaped by language, culture, and power. Phantom time can be seen as an extension of this thinking, a narrative crafted by hidden powers to control how we perceive the world, its history, and our place within it. If time is malleable, then what else might history, culture, memory, identity? All of these become suspect, open to reinterpretation. By introducing the concept of missing time, the phantom time hypothesis offers a kind of metaphysical wake-up call. What if the past is not fixed? What if it is a constantly evolving narrative, shaped by those who control the story? The theory doesn't just ask us to question the past, but to reconsider the entire framework by which we understand reality itself. One of the most profound aspects of the phantom time hypothesis is how it forces us to reconsider the relationship between time and memory. Time as we experience it is deeply tied to our subjective perception. What we remember shapes how we understand the present and how we look to the future. But what happens if our collective memory, our shared history, is unreliable or even artificially created? The more we think about this, the more we realize that our experience of time is less about an objective, linear progression and more about how we remember it. For instance, when we look back at personal memories, we often find them to be fragmented, selective, or even distorted. Our memories of events change over time, becoming influenced by external factors or internal biases. If our personal timelines can be molded by our own subjectivity, then what does this say about our collective timeline? If history is nothing more than a collection of memories, both individual and collective, how can we trust the stories we tell about the past? Phantom time invites us to consider that history itself might be as malleable as our memories, shaped not just by the passage of time, but by those who control the narrative. This relationship between memory and subjectivity goes beyond the scope of historical inquiry and touches on how we experience the present. If we are capable of rewriting the past, whether through historical revisionism or personal memory reconstruction, what does that mean for how we understand ourselves in the here and now? The present in many ways becomes the intersection of these multiple timelines, the factual, the remembered, and the constructed. In this light, time becomes less a sequence of objective events and more a construct we live in, interact with, and often reshape to suit our current understanding. Phantom time challenges the fluidity of history and forces us to reckon with the fact that our understanding of time is never fully objective. Instead, it is an ongoing negotiation between the past, the present, and how we choose to interpret both. If time can be constructed, then the way we experience it in our daily lives, in our societies, and in our culture is equally subject to reshaping. The impact of the phantom time hypothesis on society would be profound. If time itself can be manipulated, the very structure of our reality becomes vulnerable to scrutiny. Time isn't just a personal experience, it's the framework through which we understand political power, cultural identity, and social organization. Political systems, for instance, rely heavily on the legitimacy of historical narratives. Governments trace their authority back through time, often using the weight of historical legacy to justify their rule. If entire periods of history can be fabricated, what does this say about the legitimacy of modern governments and the structures that rely on a constructed timeline? Consider national holidays, commemorative events, and historical monuments, all of which are deeply tied to our understanding of the past. If we question the timeline, we also question the very basis of these cultural markers. What happens to our sense of national identity when we realize that the events we've built our societies upon might not have happened at all, or that they happened in a different form than we've been told? The fabric of political power, built on shared memories, starts to unravel when those memories come under attack. The phantom time hypothesis also has a cultural impact. The idea that history itself can be shaped, manipulated, or even erased challenges the entire concept of cultural identity. Cultural identity is built on the understanding that a group's shared history defines who they are. From the tales of ancient ancestors to the struggles of more recent generations, these shared memories shape how people see themselves in the world. If we lose our connection to history, or worse, discover that history has been altered, then who are we? This existential crisis is not just academic, it's deeply felt by individuals and societies alike. If history is just a constructed narrative, then how do we create meaning? How do we justify our place in the world? The consequences of the phantom time hypothesis go beyond historical theory. They touch the very soul of society. In an age where globalization, migration, and cultural exchange have blurred traditional boundaries, a theory like phantom time raises the question: how do we hold on to our identity in a world where the past is as fluid as the present? On a more personal level, the phantom time hypothesis forces us to confront a psychological dilemma. How do we construct our own identity if the past we rely on can be fabricated? For most people, identity is closely tied to the concept of time, the narrative of where they come from, the generations before them, and the events that have shaped who they are. If time is not linear, if our understanding of the past is fluid, then how does this affect our self-concept? Personal timelines often function like a mental anchor, helping us make sense of our lives. We connect with our ancestors through stories, traditions, and historical events. But what happens when the historical events we've always relied on, those that define our culture, nation, and personal story, are thrown into question? The more we contemplate the possibility of fabricated time, the more we realize that memory and identity are not just about what we've lived, but about the stories we believe. If those stories are artificial, how does that affect our sense of self? This psychological effect is not limited to the grand scale of nations or historical figures, it extends to the individual. Consider how we view personal memory. We often see it as a mirror to our life's events, reflecting our growth, our relationships, and our achievements. But if memories can be distorted,
If entire periods can be fabricated, what does that say about the reliability of self-perception? Phantom time introduces a crisis of self-understanding. It suggests that we may not be as anchored in the past as we think. For instance, personal memories may be influenced by outside forces, just as history can be influenced by those who shape the records. If the timeline itself is unreliable, then perhaps our understanding of the present, and by extension our understanding of ourselves, is more fluid than we like to admit. The consequences are profound. A deeper sense of disorientation about who we are and where we fit into the broader story of the world. In the modern world, the cultural and political implications of the phantom time hypothesis are far-reaching. If history can be fabricated or erased, then power takes on an entirely new dimension. Governments, corporations, and other influential groups have long used history as a tool for shaping public perception, creating myths that justify their actions and solidify their control. But if time itself can be questioned, then these tools of manipulation might be even more potent than we realize. Consider the way national identities are often built on the concept of a shared, unified history. Countries create national narratives that glorify certain events, celebrate certain figures, and forget others. The phantom time hypothesis challenges this by suggesting that history is not a neutral backdrop, but something actively shaped and manipulated. If entire periods of history can be fabricated, what does that say about the authority of modern governments, political parties, and international organizations to define their own narratives? What happens when the truth of a nation's history is called into question, not just in one period, but potentially in its very foundation? This challenge to historical authority also extends to the digital age, where narratives are constantly rewritten in real time. In the era of fake news, social media, and algorithmic manipulation, the very concept of truth has become fragile. Just as history can be manipulated, so too can our daily experiences of reality. If the past is unreliable, how can we trust the information we encounter in the present? How do we navigate a world where information can be altered, deleted, or fabricated at the click of a button? In many ways, the phantom time hypothesis serves as a warning for our times. It forces us to confront the possibility that powerful forces are already shaping our understanding of the past, and by extension, our understanding of the present. What happens when we lose trust in history itself, when we no longer know whether the stories we've been told are true or fabricated? In this environment, the very idea of history as something stable, trustworthy, and rooted in reality becomes uncertain, leaving us to question not just the past, but the very nature of truth and knowledge itself. The ethical consequences of manipulating history, as suggested by the phantom time hypothesis, are far-reaching and complex. At its core, altering history undermines the integrity of truth itself. When historical events are fabricated, manipulated, or erased, we are no longer dealing with objective facts, but with narratives constructed for a specific purpose. The ethical question becomes, who decides which parts of history are worth remembering and which are forgotten? This manipulation of the past raises critical concerns about power and control. History is a reflection of society's values, struggles, and achievements. By rewriting it, those in power can shape public perception and influence how future generations will understand their place in the world. The ethical dilemma lies in the fact that when history is altered, it erases the stories of those who were excluded, marginalized, or oppressed. In a world where history can be rewritten, who will ensure that the voices of the oppressed are not erased in the process? This ethical question leads us to the concept of authenticity in a world where history is constantly being shaped, altered, and manipulated. If we cannot trust the past, how do we reclaim a sense of authenticity in our lives? The challenge for the modern world is to find a way to reconnect with the truth without falling prey to manipulation or distortion. The question is not just about the past, but about how we live in the present. How do we navigate a world that is increasingly built on constructed realities, whether they are political, cultural, or digital? One possible solution lies in transparency and accountability. If we are to trust our history and by extension our future, we must be willing to confront the uncomfortable truths about our past, no matter how messy or inconvenient. This means not only preserving the past, but also ensuring that it is accurately represented, with all its complexity and contradictions. Reclaiming authenticity in the modern world requires us to acknowledge the past in all its layers, and to resist the temptation to rewrite it in service of a specific agenda. Only then can we begin to rebuild trust in the narrative of time itself. One of the most important tools we have to reclaim authenticity in the face of manipulated history is education. In a world where historical narratives can be shaped, distorted, or fabricated, it becomes crucial that we educate ourselves, not just about dates and events, but about the process of historical inquiry itself. Education must go beyond memorizing facts. It must teach us to question, to critically analyze the sources of information, and to recognize the ways in which history is influenced by political, cultural, and ideological forces. For instance, when studying history, it is important to consider whose voice is being heard and whose is being silenced. By learning how to examine historical narratives with a critical eye, we empower ourselves to recognize the biases embedded in the stories we've been told. This is especially important in an age where information is not just passed down but constantly revised and reinterpreted. A well-educated public, armed with historical literacy, can better navigate the flood of information in today's digital world and discern the difference between truth and manipulated narratives. At the heart of this educational approach is the cultivation of critical thinking. The phantom time hypothesis is a reminder that historical events are not just facts. They are interpretations of the past, and these interpretations are often influenced by the power structures of their time. Critical thinking challenges us to look beyond the surface, to question the accepted narratives, and to seek out alternative perspectives. It asks us to be skeptical of the official story, and to seek out the truths that might be buried beneath it. In this context, the role of historical literacy becomes clearer. It is not just about knowing the past, but about understanding how history is made, how it is written, edited, and preserved. By fostering a culture of critical inquiry and historical literacy, we can help ensure that the past is not manipulated to serve the interests of the powerful. Instead, we can cultivate a collective memory that is authentic, inclusive, and accurate, offering future generations a more truthful foundation on which to build. In the modern world, digital tools and archiving technologies are transforming the way we interact with history. The ability to store vast amounts of information digitally, to access and analyze historical records at the touch of a button, has fundamentally changed the way we think about time and memory. However, this shift also raises important questions about the preservation of authenticity. While digital archiving makes history more accessible than ever, it also opens the door for manipulation. With the power to edit, delete, and reframe records, we must ask, who controls the digital archives, and how can we trust the information stored within them? One of the challenges of digital history is the ephemeral nature of digital records. While physical documents can be preserved for centuries, digital files are subject to obsolescence. Technology evolves, and the formats and platforms used to store data become outdated or even abandoned. If history is increasingly stored in digital formats, can we be sure that these records will survive for future generations? Or will they, like many forgotten documents of the past, be lost to time, leaving behind gaps in the historical record that may never be filled? Another critical aspect of digital tools is their potential for rewriting history. Digital archives are not just passive repositories of information, they are active systems that can be modified, updated, and revised. With the click of a button, records can be altered, and entire historical narratives can be reshaped. This power to edit history poses an ethical dilemma. How do we ensure that digital archives are managed responsibly? The rise of AI and machine learning also adds another layer of complexity. These technologies can sift through massive datasets, uncovering patterns and making connections that would have been impossible to identify manually. However, they also raise questions about bias in how historical data is interpreted and presented. As we rely more on algorithms to understand the past, we must ensure that these systems are not reinforcing existing biases or presenting a skewed version of history. In this way, the digital age presents both an opportunity and a challenge. While we have access to more historical data than ever before, we must be vigilant about how that data is used and the potential for manipulation. As we look to the future, the rapid advancement of technology presents both exciting possibilities and significant challenges for preserving historical truth. Artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and blockchain technology are all poised to revolutionize how we interact with history, but they also raise new concerns about the manipulation of time and memory. In particular, AI's ability to generate deep fakes, rewrite narratives, and create entirely fabricated historical events presents a new frontier in the battle for truth. While technology has made history more accessible, it also makes it easier to fabricate and manipulate. For example, the development of deep learning algorithms allows machines to analyze historical texts, create historical reconstructions, and even produce entirely new historical narratives based on data. While this can be useful for uncovering hidden patterns, it also creates an ethical dilemma. When machines can alter, invent, or reinterpret historical records, how can we trust the authenticity of the past? As technology continues to advance, we must grapple with the question of whether machine-generated history can ever be as trustworthy as the human-driven historical inquiry we rely on today. One of the most promising developments in future technology is blockchain, which offers the potential to create immutable records of historical events. Blockchain could ensure that historical documents and data are preserved without the possibility of manipulation, providing a transparent, decentralized way to store history. However, even this technology is not free from challenges. As blockchain becomes more widespread, there will be questions about who controls the ledger, who decides what gets recorded, and how we ensure that these records reflect authentic historical truth, rather than a distorted or incomplete narrative. Furthermore, virtual reality and augmented reality hold the potential to bring history to life in ways that were once unimaginable. Through immersive experiences, we could experience history firsthand, walking through ancient cities or witnessing pivotal moments in time. But just as digital tools can distort history, these immersive technologies can also be used to reframe historical events in ways that align with a specific narrative. Will we use VR to enhance our understanding of the past, or will we use it to rewrite it? The line between education and manipulation becomes more blurred as technology continues to evolve. As we move into an era of advanced technology, the challenge will be to find a balance between innovation and integrity, ensuring that future generations can experience a history that is both authentic and unbiased. As we move into the future, it's clear that preserving historical truth will require new strategies, new technologies, and a renewed commitment to integrity. The rapid pace of technological change means that the tools we use to understand the past, from digital archives to AI systems, must be designed with transparency, ethics, and accountability in mind. Society will need to embrace a collective responsibility to ensure that the stories we tell about the past are not manipulated, distorted, or erased. In an age where information is currency, historical truth is under constant threat. To protect it, we must foster a culture of critical thinking, historical literacy, and open inquiry. Educating future generations to question and analyze the narratives they encounter is essential. This means not only teaching facts, but also teaching the process of historical inquiry, helping people understand how history is made, recorded, and passed down, so that they can spot distortions or fabrications when they occur. Furthermore, we must build institutions that safeguard the integrity of historical records, whether through public archives, independent scholars, or open source technologies, these institutions must be transparent, accessible, and committed to preserving all sides of history, not just the version that fits the dominant narrative. In the end, the phantom time hypothesis serves as a stark reminder of the importance of truth in shaping our collective identity and understanding of the world. Time itself may be a construct subject to manipulation, but that does not mean we are powerless to reclaim it. Through education, technology, and ethical inquiry, we can ensure that history remains a tool for understanding, not a weapon for control. As we look to the future, we must confront the reality that our relationship with time, history, and truth is more fragile than we think. But rather than fearing this fragility, we can use it as a call to action. Let us embrace our role as custodians of history, ensuring that the past we pass on to future generations is one built on integrity, accountability, and authenticity. The truth may be complex, messy, and difficult to uncover, but it is our responsibility to keep searching for it, preserving it, and sharing it with the world.